So now we will continue about sovereignty, and we will have an American point of view from an American living in Paris. So Leslie, it's up to you.
I have my laptop and I also have a USB key, whichever is easier.
Maybe your laptop directly, if you prefer. Yeah.
Let's see what happens. If it's bad, we have a USB key.
Okay, donc. This plug.
Hello, nice human. Nice human getting his jacket.
No. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Yes, we should do that more often so we can meet on nice topics. More elevated.
One moment.
Okay, no problem. Is it working?
I think so.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with
Okay, very well. Okay, so do you want this mic or here it's
hold on 1 second while I...
Oui.
My full screen off.
Oui, alors je termine à 17h30.
Bonjour, ça va? Bien, et toi?
On s'appelle si tu veux.
Vous souhaitez regarder.
Désolé, mon français est très mal. I think I need to do something stupid with the displays now. Just give me a second. And if it doesn't work, I have a USB key, so that's pretty good.
La Suède, elle doit être aussi ici.
Ah, bon après. Ouais. Mais du coup, si tu l'ouvres, elle peut pas le mettre dessus. Non. Ah si, ah oui.
Mais au pire, si elle soit d'ici, elle a juste à refaire.
Ouais.
No, I'm not happy. Can you help?
No, it's not true.
I apply. Hold on, wait, maybe it's apply.
Yes, something is happening. Okay,
Yay,
it's okay.
we won!
And you need to conserve the change or it will revert to be the change.
Keep change? Okay.
Because otherwise it will revert.
You are a wonderful human, thank you. There we go. Okay. That doesn't look like full screen. All right, well, I'm not going to... Thank you. Okay. I am not going to be too fussy about the slides. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming and attending my talk. I just wanted to start off by saying a couple of things that I am not. I am not an expert in digital sovereignty by any means. I am not a computer scientist. I am not a creator of code. I am an engineer of human systems, and I've been working in open source community management for about the last 20 years. I also would like to think that I have a unique perspective to offer to the community about the concept of digital sovereignty based on my past history. Very early in my career, I worked for a US hyperscaler, Google Incorporated, and I managed the Google Summer of Code program, which meant I had the opportunity to meet open source developers all over the entire world. It was an amazing experience. It has forever changed my life, and it has forever left me a true believer in the power of collaboration to solve all of the world's problems. It may just take longer than we would all wish it did, and I truly believe that we can solve all of the world's problems by working together well. About Anyway, I stopped working for a US hyperscaler back in 2010 because I had ethical concerns, but we'll get to that part later. And then eventually I moved to Europe a little over 7 years ago, and I am now a resident of Germany. I am the mother of a German citizen, and I am also the mother of a disabled child. My daughter was born with almost no sight. She gets along really well, and she sees more than most people, I think, who are fully sighted does in her own way. But it is another part of what's shaped my life experience and shaped the perspective of the remarks that I'm going to be making today. And I have one more. I'm grateful to Red Hat for sponsoring my travel here today, but these are not Red Hat's opinions by any stretch of the imagination. These are my own perspectives as an individual human being who cares very deeply about these questions and these problems, because I recognize the impact that it has in my life as a resident of Europe, as someone who chose to live in Europe because I believe in European values, and as someone who knows that her daughter will grow up in Europe and is really, really happy about that. So one of the first remarks that I wanted to offer is that open source, actually, based on my past experience, has really been a misused vehicle. It has been promulgated to society, to companies, to public administrations as this tool for transparency and trust and a way in which we can be assured that particular vendors are good actors in marketplaces. So when I think back to my early history with Google and looking at, working on the Google Summer of Code program, which was a world-changing experience for many people. The purpose of that program, as it was rolled out, in addition to being a way to potentially train more software developers with open source skills, was really a tool for Google to be able to have discussions with the outside world about what mattered to Google from a business perspective and a values perspective at a time when the company wasn't disclosing anything about its business operations. I mean, the company was notoriously quiet, didn't have much discussion with the press about anything, did not do any product announcements. There weren't really any products to announce at that point. So this idea was that open source was a way for the marketplace to gain trust in the work that Google was doing, even as people were starting to have questions about what does it mean to algorithmically determine what a user sees when they do an internet search, leading to now today where when I do an internet search, you and I don't see the same internet. Like, there is no one internet anymore. What has been provided to us is what an algorithm has selected for us, for good or for ill, and I would argue frequently for ill. And now, as I've progressed in my career and I'm seeing, again, what is the world now that we have had many years of US-based hyperscalers making decisions about how technology will be implemented in our daily lives, and these folks are still very excited to tell their customers that their offerings that can be deployed across their cloud platforms are open source. All of our technologies are open source. We have our own version of Kubernetes, which is fully open source. We have our own version of Kafka, which is fully open source. We have our own version of, you name the tool, it is available on these cloud platforms, and they can advocate that it is all open source. And yet, at the same time, that's not actually true, because application portability, as we all know, is not a seamless process. So I find it unfortunate that we now find ourselves at a time debating if open source is actually a tool for protecting our citizens, because it comes with it this history of people using open and open washing in order to convince people that they should have a relationship of trust with an organization that hasn't necessarily earned that trust. And I'm touching the wrong computer. I'm going to touch the right computer. So this is just this is my moment to sort of stand at the front of the room and say, when I hear about debates of digital sovereignty, I don't blame anyone for being afraid or thinking badly of working with American tech companies. Like, I still work for an American tech company. I think they do good stuff. That's why I still work there. I stopped working at the ones I thought were doing bad stuff. But this is the very easy research I was able to do in about 5 minutes on what some of the big US hyperscalers we know about are in the headlines for these days. My personal favorite is the only 16 biggest scandals that Mark Zuckerberg has faced. Only 16. He's doing a good job. He didn't get up to 20. And again, this current investigation before the United States Congress of Amazon prejudicing its own products, despite any other markings that should show that a product has a potentially better user experience, like actual user ratings, et cetera, that's concerning, right? This is undermining a sense of fair play, of a free market. And when we look at things like the disclosures that Frances Haugen has made about how Facebook is a tool that the company understands is radicalizing people and propagating a platform where people are performing violent acts, that's deeply concerning. So I 100% get, you know, anti-American sentiments. I completely understand why there isn't trust. I'm not here to advocate that that is an unfair position to take, because I think it's actually a very fair position to take. And I also note, too, that there is this argument when we talk about digital sovereignty that is underpinned by this messaging that European economic development is critical. If we look at cloud spending in the European Union, the amount of cloud spending in the European Union that is going to European Union-based companies is dropping dramatically. I think it was $2 billion last year that left Europe and instead went to companies in America. And as someone who lives in Europe and wants to see a bright economic future for Europe and for Europeans, I find that statistic deeply concerning. And I also note that, again, as the gentleman who were sitting up here before me made the point so astutely, we need to have investment in order for there to be, you know, upskilling for our developer communities. We need for these businesses who are selling open source software that is made in Europe and supports European values to be able to have developers to hire or systems administrators to hire. These are skills that need to exist. And I also think, too, about questions of, you know, accessibility or sustainable development. If we hope to face the challenge that climate change brings to us, that means we're going to have to think about technology in new ways. And I absolutely believe that open source will be a part of that. And I absolutely believe that the kind of development that is actually going to be sustainable is going to be done in a place like Europe, because I've lived in America, and sustainability is not what we think about. We don't know how. I remember moving here and being completely and totally confused by the idea that you had to pay for water and there wasn't ice in every drink. I know that sounds silly, but it's just a small thing when you realize that the typical American takes it for granted that there is an incredibly large freezer on all the time, sucking down a lot of power because you should not drink your drink at room temperature. It's just not what we do. So I absolutely believe that when we're thinking about digital sovereignty as a concept, this idea of it's as an underpinning of European economic development is crucial, and I agree that that is an important goal that should not be overlooked. This is where I get scared. And where I get scared is, what do we actually mean by digital sovereignty? And I was actually really comforted by the previous panel hearing from Stefan and from Peter and from Timo when they were framing digital sovereignty as a question of control of your own destiny and control over your ability to define your infrastructure and to make sure that the software that you are using for that infrastructure is created in a way that is commensurate with your value system. I've heard some people talk about digital sovereignty as the idea of a resilient software supply chain, right? The United States government cannot get you in trouble because you shipped your software to a country that they decided they didn't like that week because people who weren't me elected a moron. I'm still sorry for that, if anyone wants to know. You know, maybe by digital sovereignty we mean that there's going to be no vendor lock-in because there is freedom of choice, but I truly believe that that freedom of choice is preserved by using open source software. It is not necessarily by using open source software that was only made in Europe and only made by Europeans. And I think Peter made this point really astutely before, but like, if we start thinking about the idea of digital sovereignty means software that is going to be useful to citizens and residents of Europe as something that we should only, should only be made by Europeans, we are in a lot of trouble. Like, do we stop at just cloud software? I don't, as Peter said, we could just, if we want to go down that path, we can just throw out Linux, because Linux was made by everybody, and that to me that is a terrifying idea, because not only will that ensure that Europe is not able to be economically viable if we're all trying to create our own operating system instead of solving, in my humble opinion, more important problems like climate change. It's not actually an effective, helpful thing to do, nor is shutting down the ability to collaborate and take useful ideas from where they may come from, even if it's someone from beyond our borders where we don't live. Good ideas come from everywhere. And I will also note, as an early employee of a US hyperscaler and having many friends who still work for US hyperscalers, we should never forget, even for a moment, that a lot of those US-based companies have built their companies with engineers from Europe who they have imported to the United States of America in order to build these technologies. And I think that if there is the right investment and heart in Europe, those engineers will happily come back to Europe. And quite frankly, there are a lot of Americans like myself who would be much happier contributing our time, skills, and labor to creating software and creating business ecosystems that support European values, because they're good values and they're values that I truly believe in, or I wouldn't be here. And I also just wanted to make the point that these questions that I'm asking about where does this stop and what does digital sovereignty really mean, like, I'm not just here to speak as an intellectual exercise. These questions really matter to me. So right now the best voice recognition and voiceover technology in the world is produced by Apple Incorporated and is integrated with iOS. So, and I also live in Europe, and in Europe, approximately 1 in 30 Europeans are blind or severely visually impaired, like my child. So at some point, if the European Union or the European Commission or another body decides that they're going to invest deeply in accessibility software, because as more and more of our population is aging, the need for that accessibility software is ever growing. Okay, so I am an American. I hold a United States passport. I currently have residency in the country of Germany because I am the mother of a German citizen. But like, how far does this go? Does this mean that no one will take contributions from me if this is an open source software package? Does this mean I will not be allowed to download and install and run this software for my kid if these things happen? And I know that these sound like potentially farcical outcomes, but they are not farcical outcomes when we are thinking about how we want to make the rules of who we want to come along with us in our journey. And we are starting to think about those questions not in terms of the values that we share, but in terms of where we sit in the world, where our passport is from. Like we need to be able to treat individuals and their value systems on a realistic basis, and not simply paint wide swaths of, if you come from here, if you think this thing, you are my enemy. Like, this is not the way that the world improves itself. I also wanted to just touch on the point that, at least from what I have seen, and I was, again, greatly comforted by the preceding panel, most of the conversations that I have heard on digital sovereignty focus almost exclusively on this concept of the need to create a European hyperscaler. We must create a European hyperscaler that can provide competition to US-based hyperscalers. And I think, I don't disagree with that premise, but I do think that what is happening is so much of the discussion is focused in that way that we just simply stop asking the right questions. Like, first of all, the tactics that these companies used in order to create their hyperscaler businesses are not necessarily tactics that I would espouse if we want to create sustainable companies with ethical value systems. You can define ethical value system however you want, but I think if we look at what are expressed European values, for example, from the Berlin Declaration of 2020, human-centered AI is not part of how hyperscalers build their systems, right? So I don't even know that we should be asking ourselves only, how do we create another hyperscaler? I think we should be asking ourselves, how do we create more sustainable businesses that are focused on free and open source software, and how do we promulgate that throughout European society, both from the perspective of public sector investment and also private sector creation and purchase. And last but not least, I also wanted to point out, like, as we are talking about what are the questions that we are asking, and are they the right questions when we're thinking about what digital autonomy or digital sovereignty looks like for Europe? I think I have a couple of different questions to suggest that we could start with, or at least continue asking. Like, so what are the legal tools that we have in place that can protect our citizens and protect their data? Like, if GDPR has taught us anything, it is that when Europe makes legislation around data protection for its citizens, the world pays attention. They actually do something about it. And you can actually take companies to court that violate these laws. And if we could get to the point where we would increase the fines for these entities to the point where it actually economically hurt them, I guarantee you they will stop doing these things as much as it is technically possible for them to do so. Another, secret, not so secret thing, like, none of the hyperscalers actually know where your data is. It doesn't matter what what region you, like zone or region you buy your stuff in. Your data is God only knows where. Other questions, are there actually already ways in place to achieve massive distributed compute that does not entail people needing to like have a hyperscale entity to transact with? And I would argue that there are models that are being created now that would support that. If you look at the Cloud Commodities Exchange, there's a notion now being created by an organization in Germany that for organizations that already have spare compute power, instead of needing to have a business relationship with one particular hyperscaler or one particular organization, you can just buy your compute time as a commodity, use a software catalog, and you're ready to go. These are the kinds of innovative questions that I think we can answer in ways that are commensurate with European values and don't actually involve needing to figure out how we build more data centers to suck in more energy and to continue cooking the planet. And my last point is, I think, again, when we start asking questions about hyperscaling, I don't think the good outcome is a bunch of is a very few tech players. I don't think that being in Europe means that a large business is somehow differently incentivized to make as much profit as possible. And it turns out the way to make as much profit as possible is by not caring about the needs of the humans who use your products. But small companies do care about the humans who use their products because they can get on a train and they can come to your office and they can tell you what they need your software to do, what they need you as a business to do, what they are hoping you are doing in your employee relationships, right? Those kinds of connections matter. And I think if we consistently focus on how can we create the next big thing, we're missing out on the opportunity to create billions of beautiful little things that outshine the few big things that we have been taught are the thing that we should care for and the thing that we should strive for, because I fundamentally question that premise. And I think that that premise has led us to where we are now, where we are in an environmental crisis. That's all I have to say. I hope this was useful to you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Do you have questions in the audience?
Digital sovereignty, good. Not using code developed in America, probably bad. Don't just say that because I work for Red Hat. TLDR, thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Yes, we have a question here.
I find it very hard to understand how to disambiguate copyright when it comes to open source in terms of contributions. Because from my understanding, at least with some of the foundations, you don't actually have to assign your copyright even for contributions anymore.
Yep.
So there, how can I say this piece of software is owned by such and such? Because all the contributions do not lead up to that. And so that's
Yes.
a challenge that I would question to the last panel to some degree, and I wanted to see if you had some thoughts on that.
Yes, I do. Thank you very much for the question. So when it comes to the question of copyright is very important. So there are two different ways to think about copyright. One is an individual creator retains copyright to the work that they have created. And that functions completely differently depending on where you live. In France, we have droit d'auteur. In the United States, we have United States copyright law, and everyone has their own flavor of copyright law. In the instance where the individual creator retains the copyright or the moral authority over their work, then Jean-Paul's statement, which was perfectly reasonable one, is that that person is subject to the laws of wherever they live, and presumably most people stay in the country where they have citizenship. So even if they retain their own copyright, they are still potentially subject to laws which people find onerous. If you do copyright assignment of the work that you have created to, for example, your company, because it's done as work for hire, or you assign the copyright of the code you create to a software foundation as a neutral entity, then they are the ones who are subject to the laws in whatever jurisdiction they happen to find themselves, which I think is part of a huge reason why the Eclipse Foundation, I don't want to speak for the Eclipse Foundation, I don't work for the Eclipse Foundation, but if you look at their move to Europe, they are now subject to the laws of, Brussels, so they operate in the city of Brussels, so there's municipal law, there's countrywide law, there's European law, right? So that's changed how enforcement can be done on code that is owned by the Eclipse Foundation, right? Those laws have changed. They can make the argument that they are no longer subject to U.S. export control. Now, the other wonderful reality we need to realize is it doesn't matter who owns the software. If the U.S. government or anyone else gets angry that you put software in something and shipped it somewhere, they're still going to find a way to let you know they're upset about it. They don't actually care who owns the copyright.
Thank you. Another question? No, it's okay. So we can move maybe. Thank you very much, Leslie.
Thank you.
To the next.